Hey guys, Nicole here with Obscure Reptiles and Caging, and today we're going to be talking about how often you should be feeding your ball python. So let's get started. Hey guys, today we're talking about feeding your ball python, how often you should do it. We're going to go over a bunch of different variables for if it's a breeder versus a pet, the age of that snake, the gender of that snake, and a whole bunch of other things. When it comes to your ball python, we'll start off with babies. Whether you're going to breed that snake or have it as a pet, when they are babies, they generally eat every 3 to 5 days. Every time you feed your snake, you want the same width around of your snake. That is the size of the meal. So if you are feeding a hatchling ball python, generally they're around 60 to 70 grams when they first hatch out. You're going to be feeding large pinky rats, hopper fuzzy mice, or hopper or a little bit larger ASF rats. So when I'm saying the largest part of your ball python, if this is the head of your ball python and this is the fattest part of that snake's body, that is how big approximately your meal should be for that snake. So again, if this is the biggest part of your ball python, let's say even older one, that's how big you should be feeding it. When you feed that ball python, you should very slightly see a lump in their body, because if you're feeding a little bit bigger than the biggest part of their body, where their stomach and all their internal organs are, stuff like that, so when you feed it and it fully swallows it, let's say the next day you check that snake out and you look at it, you will see a little bit of a lump in their belly right around that biggest part of their body. That is the best way to feed your ball python. So that is the sizing we're going to go with for this entire video. So if you're feeding a hatchling ball python, that same size, that biggest part of their body, which some babies hatch out at 30 grams, some hatch out at 100 grams. Snakes are all different when they come out. Right out the gate, they already are all different. So go with that, and I will tell you how often if that is the size that you are feeding. Keep in mind there's a lot of variables when it comes to mice versus rats, but generally if you are feeding, let's say, a full-grown mouse, that is about the size of a weaned rat approximately. So your baby, let's say it is a 6-month-old and under baby, you're going to want to feed that baby every 3 to 5 days. Generally what we do here for the first 3 months of feeding, we will do every 3 days, we will offer food. Keep in mind, because we are breeders, we're getting them from the egg, we're waiting for them to shed, we're getting them to start eating. In that first 3 months, generally it takes a couple of feedings for them to start eating, and then every 3 days from there we continue to offer food, but only for about those first 3 months, when only about 1 or 2 of those first 3 months of them being here are they actually eating for us. Now, if it's between 3 and 6 months old, we're going to switch it to every 5 days. The reason why we do this is we don't want to overfeed that animal, but we want to make sure that that animal is still growing and getting good size on them. Now, depending on who you talk to, some people at the 6-month mark, some people at the 1-year mark, that is when they switch from every 5 days to every 7 days. Once we hit that 6-month mark, we generally start to feed every 7 days. Occasionally, we'll give them an extra meal depending on how well they're growing. Ball pythons, especially when they're babies, they tend to grow in length very quickly, so we don't want them to get too skinny, too small. So depending on that snake, we will adjust accordingly. Some ball pythons are very picky, so if they do not eat, we will continue them on that 5-day schedule to make sure that they are still growing, that they are doing well if they're very picky. If they eat like monsters, we're only going to do it every 7 days after that 6-month mark. But again, it all depends on how well that snake is growing. If you have a snake skipping a bunch of meals, I would just stick with that 5-day. And I would also really consider checking your setup, make sure everything is perfectly dialed in, because if that snake is skipping meals, that could mean that there is something wrong with the temperature, the humidity, you have that snake in a loud area, something like that, something that's stressing it out. Maybe you're handling it a little too often for its liking. So it all depends on how it's growing, and with time you will learn. But ball pythons specifically, you want them to be a heavier bodied animal. You don't want them to be overweight, we don't like fat snakes, and we don't want them to be underweight. So a great rule of thumb is, if this is your ball python, if you see almost a teardrop shape, like as in you can see the spine, they are too skinny, you're going to want to increase the meal size slightly, or the frequency in which you are feeding that animal. If they're oval shaped and not round, oval shape, or when they actually will turn their body and if you see a bunch of rolls in that turn, then they are too fat and you're going to want to skip and do every other meal, or again, maybe give them smaller meals, maybe skip every other meal, every third meal, something like that, to make sure that they are of good body weight. Overweight snakes tend to live a lot less, and if you power feed, you overfeed that snake, same thing. It's going to shorten that snake's life drastically. Personally, again, us here, Twisted Reptiles, for our ball pythons, we are big believers in occasionally skipping meals or throwing in a meal at different times. We don't only feed on, let's say, Sundays. We always switch it up, and the reason why is because in the wild, ball pythons don't have a consistent meal every Sunday at 6 o'clock. They have very sporadic meals. Some of our bigger snakes are every 7 to 10 days, but that's for our snakes that are, let's say, 2 to 5 years old. They are older. We don't want them to get too big. We want to stay consistent. We want them to not get, especially our breeder males, when they get a little bit larger, we don't want them to at all be fat. Then they tend to be lazy breeders. So we will not go longer than, let's say, 10 days for a food. Maybe we'll skip a random meal. Sometimes we'll skip a random meal here or there, like if we went on, let's say, a camping trip for a couple of days that was feeding, we'll either skip it or we'll push it back a couple of days, but we always feed different days, different times of the day, and we try to keep it very random so that snake doesn't have an expectation. That kind of, for us at least, gives them a really good feeding response because they don't really know when the next meal is going to come. I personally have found that feeding them sporadically gets them to eat better than feeding them, let's again say, every single Sunday. So depending on the age of the snake, let's say today's a Monday, we feed our very small babies. Then Tuesday maybe we're going to feed all of our grow outs. Wednesday we'll feed all of our males. Thursday we'll feed all of our females. And then Friday we'll feed the babies again. And then we'll start over that week. And then maybe instead of feeding the males Tuesday, we'll feed the males and the females Wednesday because we have some extra time. But we always switch it up. There's really no weeks that is exactly the same. Sometimes we'll go a day early, sometimes we'll do a day or two late. But if you are breeding your ball pythons, you have to also consider, and they're generally not going to eat very much, especially breeder males. If they're also breeding, then they tend to not want to eat as much. So we will feed them every, let's say, 5 to 7 days. Let's say starting 1 month before they actually start breeding, or 2 months before they start breeding, so they get a little extra size on them in preparation for them going into breeding. Again, we don't want to make fat, overweight snakes, but we want to give them a little bit extra calories, a little bit extra power to be able to get them through the breeding season, because if a male is going to go off feed for a couple of months and we have to stop him from using him in our breeding cycle, we try to avoid that when at all possible. So if instead of every, let's say, 7 to 10 days, we maybe do them every single week, every 5 to 7 days, and we mix it up again throughout the weeks. That way our boys and our girls are ready to go into breeding season and they stay a nice, consistent, healthy size even if they're off feed during breed. Now if you just have a pet ball python, again, especially if you have a male, it's winter time, they might go off food. That's totally okay. Make sure your size of your meals is going up as this animal ages. Don't go and buy a 500 pack of, let's say, small rats, because that snake is going to consistently continue to grow. Some are slower than others, some are faster, especially males. They tend to grow a little bit slower. For the first 3 to 5 years of their life, they're going to keep growing. They always grow their entire lives. That's why they'll continue to shed, but they shed a lot less when they're larger because they just grow very, very slowly when they're older. But for that first 3 to 5 years, keep in mind they could be jumping up food sizes quickly or slowly. Sometimes it'll be in little growth spurts, but don't over purchase, let's say if you're feeding frozen, so that way you don't waste any. Wintertime, getting cold out, and it's not eating, as long as it's not drastically losing weight, I would not worry. I wouldn't even bother offering food except maybe every other week, every third week, if that animal has been refusing for you. If your animal starts to lose weight, whether it's a male or a female, I'd highly recommend going to a vet and talking to them, making an actual appointment and go see somebody, going and seeing a trained expert. But personally here, what we do to avoid that is we weigh our ball pythons once a month, especially our females. That way, if they're on, let's say, brumation, or they're slowing down on feeding but they're still gaining weight or maintaining weight, that's a really good sign that they're growing follicles. And if you have a pet ball python, it doesn't hurt to know their weight, how they're growing, all that kind of stuff. It's only once a month. That's only 12 times a year. You can keep a little chart, little folder. You can track their feeding, stuff like that. It's not necessary, but it's a good practice to have. Alright guys, that's it for this video. If you have any questions, you can put them in the comments below. If you haven't already, please subscribe. We do new videos every single Wednesday. So I'll see you guys in the next video.